Okay, so in the last video we saw how you could connect to multiple files that reside in the same directory with the use of the wildcard character. We also saw how the input tool can search into subdirectories to bring back files that match the wildcard search. Now sometimes you will find yourself in a situation where you want to input more than one file which may not reside within the same directory, or you may want to obtain files from a directory but not all of them at once, like we saw with the wildcard example. In this video we're going to explore 3 more ways of bringing in data from multiple files, depending on what your use case is. This will be made possible by introducing 3 new tools that we haven't used before, so let's dive straight in. So the first tool we're going to drag onto the canvas is the directory tool. Now we haven't used this tool before, but it resides in the in-out tools, so simply drag it across. Now the configuration window asks us for 2 pieces of input. Firstly, it asks for the directory, i.e. the file path, that you want to bring files in from. Now using the same sales data we saw in the previous video, I will enter here the sales files directory, which resides in my data folder. And just to remind you how this looks, we had 3 Excel files and then a subdirectory with a further 2 sales files within it. The second option in the configuration window for the directory tool is the file specification. Now we will leave this as ***, which basically means all file names of all file formats. But if you wanted to specify a specific file type, for example an Excel file, then you're able to put *.xlsx for example. But seeing as we only have Excel files in this directory, we can leave this as it is. Now when I run the workflow with a single directory tool on the canvas, you can see that the directory tool generates 3 records of data in 1.1 second. Now if I click on the output anchor of the directory tool to see what data it's produced, you can see that we get various columns of information about the files. So we get the full path of each file. We can also see the directory, the file name, and more information related to each file in the directory. Now note here that this only has 3 Excel files and not the files in the subdirectory. This is because we've not selected the Include Subdirectories option in the configuration window, so the 3 records only relate to the 3 files that we have within the Sales Files directory. Now we have the full path for each file, we can once again drag a dynamic input tool onto the canvas and connect it to the directory tool. In the Input Data Source Template option within the configuration window, we will select a file which will represent the data structure of the input. So we can select the Sales 2019 as an example, and as it only has one tab called England, we can simply click OK. We therefore have a template with 6 columns with field names called ID, Year, Category, Product, Sales and Region. Now if you recall from a prior video, when we looked at bringing in multiple tabs within a single Excel file using the dynamic input, we have to select a field that will be read in as our data sources. This was previously just sheet names, but in this example, we have a lot more fields that we can choose from, as the directory tool output has a lot more information being fed into the dynamic input tool. For the action, we're going to want Alteryx to change the entire file path in order to point to different file paths of the respective files. Now seeing as each file is in the same file path, albeit with a different file name, this will yield the same result as the wildcard, but you will soon see the flexibility we get when we use this method. The last thing we're going to do is add a browse tool after the dynamic input tool, so we can observe the result afterwards. When we run the workflow, you can see it completes in 0.8 seconds, and if we were to click on the canvas and go to the messages page, you can see that the dynamic input tool has gone into each file path and read in the data accordingly, with 57 records being fed in across 3 files. And if I click on the Browse tool and scroll down the results window, you can see we have one set of data which shows the results for 2019, 2020 and 2021 all being brought into the dataset despite being from different files. Now let's add in another consideration into the mix. Let's suppose that we only wanted 2 files to be read in from this directory, not all 3. Well, this could be achieved by using the wildcard option and then renaming the files you don't want to pull in or moving them into a different folder. But this is not best practice, as moving files or changing file names could interfere with other processes that references them. So what can we do? Well, let's first just highlight the current workflow and copy and paste it underneath to create an exact replica of what we just did. Now, to see the data from both workflows, I'm going to run the workflow by pressing Ctrl and R, which will run all tools that are on the canvas. Now, currently, all 3 files are shown in the directory tool, but let's say we just wanted to feed in 2020 and the 2021 file. How do we do this? Well, we could filter out specific rows of data from the directory tool, so that we're left with just the necessary file paths. So let's just move the directory tool over to the right a little bit, and then we will insert a new tool called the filter tool, which forms part of the preparation toolset. Now, we will touch on this tool in more detail in the preparation section, but at a high level, what this tool enables us to do is create conditions that split the data into 2 streams. If the data meets the stipulated conditions, it will feed into the true output anchor, i.e. the green arrow that says T, or if rows of data do not meet the stipulated conditions, it will feed into the false anchor. Now, our intention is to filter the 2020 and 2021 file paths into the T stream. So in the filter configuration option, we will write a custom filter which states that we want the full path field to equal the 2020 file path, or the full path field to equal the 2021 file path. Now, don't worry too much about this for now. Simply note that we're taking an input from the directory tool, which has rows of data in it, and before this data is fed into the dynamic input tool, we are adding in a filter tool which is going to filter out some of the data. Only those records which meet the conditions we stipulate in the filter tool configuration window will feed through into the T stream, which is the output anchor that we'll use when feeding it into the dynamic input tool. When we now run the workflow, it runs in 1.1 second, and we can see a few more messages in the results window. Firstly, we can see that the first directory tool and the subsequent dynamic input tool has read in the 3 files like we know it did from the first example. Now, when we look at the second workflow, we can see that only 2 files were read in by the dynamic input tool, 2020 and 2021 respectively. Now, just as a side note for navigation purposes, each tool is given an ID, or a name, which is then referenced in the messages window. So if I click on the second directory tool, we can see that this tool is called directory brackets 4. And if I click on the annotation box, we are then able to change the name of this tool accordingly to make it clearer what it is doing. The new name would then feed into the message window. But as of now, if I go back to the messages, you can see that the directory brackets 4 tool is generating 3 records, and the filter is telling us that 2 records were true and 1 was false, hence why we're only getting 2 outputs. If I click on the T anchor, we can see the 2 records accordingly. And if I click on the Browse tool, I can see that we have a single dataset with only the 2020 and 2021 sales data feeding in, whereas the first workflow is feeding in all 3 sets of data. Okay, so we've just seen a way of being able to have more precision with our file path selections, but I just want to show you one more way of stipulating file paths that can replicate what we've just done, but also gives us flexibility to have file paths that are completely different. So once again, we'll copy and paste the first workflow as a starting point. But this time, rather than having a directory tool in which we specify a single directory, we will delete the directory tool by right-clicking and pressing delete, and then replacing it with a new tool known as the text input. Now, the text input tool is essentially a manual input. We are able to create our own tables of data with rows and columns right in the configuration window. We can also paste from the clipboard for tables you want to move from Excel into Alteryx directly, which we'll see in a different video. But for this example, what we're going to do is simply add our file paths to this text input tool. So let's go to one of the file paths, which we can do by clicking on the first directory tool and then selecting a cell in the results window and pressing Ctrl C. And then we can go back across to the text input and press Ctrl V in the first row. We will also paste it in for a second time in the second row, but this time relabel this to be 2020. Now you could put any file path you wanted in this table, which would then be fed into the dynamic input tool. But in this example, I will keep it as 2019 and 2020, so it's slightly different input from the prior example. Also, to keep things clean, I will rename the column header of our text input table to be file paths, which I can do so by simply clicking on the header and relabeling accordingly. Now in the dynamic input tool, we could leave the template as it is, as we know it takes the same form as other templates. But just to show you that you can also use any template, providing it takes the same format, we will quickly change this template to be the 2020 template. Now the most important change we need to make is to the field option. Seeing as we've just created a text input with a field called file paths, we need to change the field to point to this new field called file paths. The action can be left as change entire file path. When we run the workflow, we can see it completes in 1.3 seconds, and we once again get a few more messages that appear in the results window. At the bottom, we can see that the text input with our specified paths have fed through into the dynamic input tool accordingly. And when we look at the browse tool and scroll down, we can see that the 2019 and 2020 data is feeding into a single dataset just as expected. So hopefully this was useful to see how to bring in multiple files of data into one dataset by using directory or text inputs to specify file paths. We can also use filter tools to be more specific as to what files we want to see. Once again, you will need to be mindful of the format of each of the datasets you're bringing in. Try to ensure the column headers and ordering are the same in each file. Explore these options on your own machine to really get comfortable with how files can be brought in using different methods. Depending on file structures and what you want to see will sometimes require a different option.